I said no at the altar in front of 300 people, and it was the freest moment of my life. My name is Rachel Morrison. I'm 29 years old. I'm a dentist in Charleston, South Carolina, and I just canceled my own wedding after discovering my fiancé saw me as an easily controlled chess piece. But before I get to that perfect moment of poetic justice, I need you to understand how I got there, because this story begins 10 days earlier, when I heard through a cracked door the words that destroyed my world and simultaneously saved me. If you've been through something similar, if you've ever felt invisible in your own relationship, stay with me. This story is for you. It was a Tuesday afternoon, late September, and Charleston's humid heat still clung to my skin like thick honey. I drove to the Whitfield estate in my 2016 Honda Civic, that reliable car Brandon always looked at with condescension, as if my choice of vehicle said something fundamental about my worth as a person. The Whitfield mansion rose imposing at the end of an avenue of centuries-old oak trees draped in Spanish moss, one of those historic southern properties that screams old money at every turn. I counted exactly 23 marble steps to the main entrance. I always counted things when I was nervous, a habit I developed in dental school during practical exams. Patricia Whitfield, my future mother-in-law, had summoned me to review the final details of the reception. In my purse, I carried lace samples for the table centerpieces, 3 different shades of ivory that honestly looked identical to me, but that Patricia insisted were worlds apart. I rang the doorbell, that deep, elegant sound that echoed inside like church bells. The housekeeper, a Salvadoran woman named Carmen who always smiled at me with genuine warmth, opened the door and indicated Mrs. Whitfield was in the library with Miss Vivian. I walked down the polished mahogany hallway, my modest $39 heels, clicking against the hardwood floor that probably cost more than all the furniture in my little bungalow. I could hear voices coming from the library. The door was ajar, just a few inches, and I immediately recognized Brandon's voice, mixed with his mother's and sister's. I was going to announce my presence, push the door open, and walk in smiling like I always did, perpetually trying to earn the approval of this family that looked at me like I was a poorly chosen charity project. But then I heard my name pronounced by Patricia with that tone I knew so well, that disdain elegantly disguised as maternal concern. I froze half a meter from the door, my heart beginning to race in that way that tells you something important is about to happen, that your life is about to change forever, even though you don't yet know exactly how. Patricia's voice cut through the mansion's cold air conditioning like a sharp knife. She was asking if Brandon was sure he wanted to marry me. A neighborhood dentist. For God's sake, a dentist. She pronounced my profession as if it were something shameful, as if dedicating my life to caring for working families' oral health was equivalent to picking up garbage. I felt my cheeks burning with that familiar combination of humiliation and contained rage. 7 years of university, 3 years of residency, student loans I was still paying off, sleepless nights studying maxillofacial anatomy, and this woman reduced all my effort to something despicable. Vivian, Brandon's sister, joined in with that sing-song, cruel tone she'd perfected since we met. She agreed with her mother, saying I didn't even know how to use silverware correctly at formal dinners. Last week at the club, she'd seen me use the salad fork for the main course. Mortifying. I closed my eyes, remembering that dinner. I'd been so nervous, so desperate to make a good impression, that I'd indeed confused the damn forks. I realized it halfway through dinner, and spent the rest of the evening with my stomach in knots, hoping no one would notice. Of course Vivian had noticed. Vivian noticed every one of my mistakes and collected them like trophies. I waited for Brandon's response. My fiancé, the man who supposedly loved me, the man I was going to share my life with in exactly 10 days. I waited for him to defend me, to tell his mother and sister that he loved me for who I was, that my profession was noble, that my humble origins were a source of pride, not shame. What I heard instead froze the blood in my veins. Brandon's voice came through that crack in the door, calm and measured, like he was discussing a business transaction instead of his future wife. He told his mother that I was grateful to be with him, that I knew I could never land a man of his social caliber on my own. That gratitude made me malleable, he said. Malleable. Like I was clay he could shape however he wanted. He continued, his voice taking on this satisfied tone that made my stomach turn, explaining that I would never question him, never demand too much, never cause problems. It was the perfect marriage for him, he said, because he could do whatever he wanted. I pressed my back against the hallway wall, my breathing shallow and quiet, not wanting to make a single sound that would alert them to my presence. My hands were shaking so badly I had to clutch my purse against my chest to steady them. The lace samples inside crinkled softly. 7 months of wedding planning. 3 years. Of dating. Countless compromises I'd made to fit into his world. And this was what he really thought of me. This was how he saw me. Not as a partner. Not as an equal. As someone grateful enough to be controlled. Vivian's voice cut in. Sharper now. More interested. She asked about that lawyer woman. Natalie something. Was she still in the picture? The pause that followed felt like it lasted an hour. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. That sick feeling of knowing something. Terrible is coming, but being powerless to stop it. Then Brandon laughed. Actually laughed. A casual, easy sound that told me this wasn't even a difficult question for him to answer. He said of course Natalie was still in the picture. Like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Rachel would never find out, he explained. I was too naive, too focused on pleasing him, too desperate to keep him happy. His voice carried this absolute certainty that made me want to scream. He knew exactly who I was, or who he thought I was, and he'd built his entire strategy around exploiting those perceived weaknesses. I stood there in that hallway with its expensive paintings and antique furniture, my entire body going cold despite the September heat outside. 3 years. 3 years I'd spent trying to be good enough for this family. 3 years of enduring Patricia's subtle digs about my background. Vivian's comments about my clothes not being quite right. Charles ignoring me entirely at family. Gatherings like I wasn't even worth acknowledging. 3 years of Brandon introducing me to his colleagues with this apologetic tone, as if he needed to explain why someone like him would be with someone like me. I remembered our first date so clearly now, seeing it through completely different eyes. We'd met at a charity gala where I'd volunteered to provide free dental screenings for underprivileged children. Brandon had approached me at the end of the night, charming and attentive, asking about my work with genuine seeming interest. He'd called me the next day, taken me to an expensive restaurant, where I'd been terrified of ordering wrong, of using the wrong fork, of saying the wrong thing. He'd been so patient with me, so understanding when I'd admitted I'd never been somewhere so fancy before. I'd thought his patience was kindness. Now I understood it was calculation. Every memory was reshaping itself in my mind, taking on new, darker meanings, the way he'd always insisted on. Paying for everything, even when I'd offered to split bills. I'd thought he was being generous. Now I saw he was establishing dependence. The way he'd discouraged me from socializing with his friends' wives, saying they were superficial and I was too genuine for them. I'd thought he was protecting me. Now I saw he was isolating me. The way he'd suggested I could cut back my hours at the clinic after we got married, that I didn't need to work so hard. I'd thought he wanted to take care of me. Now, I saw he wanted to make me financially dependent on him. My clinic. God, my clinic. I'd built that practice from nothing, working out of a tiny rented space in a strip mall for the first 2 years, slowly building a patient base of working-class families who couldn't afford the fancy downtown practices. I specialized in pediatric dentistry, making sure kids from low-income neighborhoods got the dental care they needed. I offered sliding-scale payments, worked with community health programs, stayed late to accommodate parents' work schedules. My patient satisfaction rate was 97%. 97% of people who walked into my modest clinic felt cared for and respected, but none of that mattered to the Whitfields. To them, I wasn't a successful professional who'd built something meaningful. I was just a neighborhood dentist, someone who worked with her hands, who saw Medicaid patients, who didn't summer in the Hamptons or winter in Aspen, someone who'd grown up in a small bungalow raised by her grandmother who worked as a seamstress, someone whose parents had died in a car accident when she was 6, leaving her with nothing but medical bills and grief. My grandmother, Helen. God, I missed her so much in that moment. She died 2 years ago, right before I met Brandon, and she never got to see this disaster I'd almost walked into. Helen Morrison had raised me on her seamstress income, working 16-hour days to make sure I had everything I needed. She'd been the one who encouraged me to apply to dental school, who'd co-signed my student loans even though it terrified her, who'd told me over and over that education was the one thing no one could ever take away from me. She used to say this thing, sitting at her sewing machine late at night while I studied at the kitchen table. She'd look up at me over her reading glasses and say that dignity wasn't something anyone could give you or take away. It was something you decided you had. regardless of what anyone else thought. I'd rolled my eyes at her old-fashioned wisdom, but standing in that hallway listening to my fiancé discuss his plans to control and deceive me, her words hit differently. Patricia's voice brought me back to the present, asking Brandon if he was being careful. She didn't want any scandals that could affect the family's reputation. Brandon assured her he was discreet, that Natalie understood the situation, that everything was under control. He'd been seeing her for 18 months, he said. 18 months. We'd been engaged for 14 months. He'd been cheating on me longer than he'd been planning to marry me. I don't know how long I stood there after they moved on to discussing seating arrangements for the reception, as if they hadn't just casually discussed Brandon's infidelity and his plans to manipulate me for the rest of our marriage. My legs felt like they might give out. I backed away from the door slowly, carefully, each step deliberate and silent. Carmen appeared at the end of the hallway, and I could see concern flash across her face when she saw my expression. I mouthed that I wasn't feeling well, that I'd call Mrs. Whitfield later, and somehow made it back to my car without falling apart completely. I drove without any destination in mind, just pointing my Civic away from that mansion and letting my hands operate on autopilot. Charleston blurred past me, the historic homes and church steeples and harbor views that usually made me feel grateful to live here now. Just felt like scenery in someone else's life. I ended up at Waterfront Park, sitting on a bench overlooking the Cooper River, watching the sun sink lower in the sky and turn everything golden and beautiful, while my entire world crumbled inside me. My phone buzzed repeatedly, Brandon texting to ask where I was, saying his mother mentioned I hadn't shown up for our meeting. The casualness of his lies was almost impressive. I turned the phone face down on the bench beside me and tried to breathe through the tightness in my chest. A couple walked past me holding hands, laughing about something, and I felt this sharp stab of grief for the relationship I'd thought I had. That relationship had never existed. It had been a performance, a long con, and I'd been too grateful, too eager to belong somewhere, to see it. But underneath the grief and humiliation, something else was building, something cold and clear and sharp. Anger? Yes, but more than that. Calculation. If Brandon thought I was too naive to figure things out, too desperate to take action, then he'd fundamentally misunderstood who I was. You don't build a successful dental practice from nothing by being naive. You don't get through dental school with a seamstress grandmother's income backing you by being weak. You learn to be strategic. You learn to plan. You learn to see problems from every angle and find solutions. I drove home to my bungalow as the sky turned purple. That small house on Rutledge Avenue that I'd inherited from Grandma Helen when she died. Brandon had suggested multiple times that I should sell it, that we could use the money as a down payment on something more appropriate for his social circle. I'd always found reasons to delay, telling him I wasn't ready to let go of my grandmother's house yet. Now I understood that some part of me had been protecting myself all along, keeping this one thing that was mine alone. Inside, the house still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets Grandma Helen used to make. Her sewing machine still sat in the corner of the living room because I hadn't been able to bring myself to move it. Photos of us together lined the mantel above the fireplace, me at various ages, her always smiling despite how hard she worked. I sat on the worn sofa and let myself cry for the first time since hearing Brandon's words, great heaving sobs that felt like they were tearing out of my chest. When I was empty, when there were no more. Tears left. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table where I'd done my homework as a kid. I needed to think clearly. I needed a plan, because I wasn't going to just call off the wedding and walk away quietly. That's what Brandon would expect from naive, grateful Rachel. That's what would let him save face, spin some story about how we'd mutually decided we wanted different things, how I just wasn't ready for his lifestyle. No, if he wanted to manipulate me, if he wanted to use my supposed gratitude against me, then I was going to show him exactly how wrong he'd been about who I was. The next morning, Wednesday, I went to work like normal. I had a full schedule of patients, including a 6-year-old named Marcus, who'd been terrified of dentists until I'd spent 3 appointments just letting him sit in the chair and play with the equipment. Today he let me do a full cleaning, and his mother cried with relief. This was why I did this work. This was what mattered. Not fancy, dinner parties and correct silverware placement, but making sure kids like Marcus could smile without pain. During my lunch break, I did something I'd been putting off for months. I called the number for Thomas Hendricks. the estate lawyer who'd been trying to reach me. He'd left several messages over the past few months about my grandmother's estate, but I'd assumed it was just final paperwork. Grandma Helen hadn't had anything beyond the bungalow, and some savings that had gone to her funeral. Expenses. I'd been avoiding the call because dealing with lawyers meant confronting that she was really gone. Thomas Hendrick's secretary put me through immediately, which seemed odd. His voice was warm and professional when he answered, asking if I could come to his office that afternoon. He said it was urgent and concerned my family inheritance. I explained I'd already handled my grandmother's estate, but he insisted there was something I needed to know about, something significant. The way he emphasized that last word made my stomach flip. I rearranged my afternoon schedule, asking my dental assistant Maya to reschedule 2 non-urgent cleanings. Maya had worked with me since I opened the practice, a single mother putting herself through hygienist school. She took one look at my face and asked if everything was okay. I told her I didn't know yet, which was the truth. Thomas Hendrick's office was downtown in one of those historic buildings that had been converted into professional spaces, all exposed brick and modern furnishings, very different from the strip mall where my clinic lived. His secretary offered me water, coffee, tea, treating me with a deference that seemed strange for someone whose grandmother had been a seamstress. Thomas himself was maybe 60, silver-haired and kind-eyed, and he shook my hand with both of his like we were old friends. He invited me to sit in a leather chair across from his massive desk and pulled out a thick manila folder. "Miss Morrison," he said, using my professional title with respect. "We need to discuss your grandmother Helen Morrison's family history." I told him I knew the basics, that she'd raised me alone after my parents died, that she'd worked as a seamstress her whole life, that she'd never talked much about her family before coming to Charleston. Thomas nodded slowly, then opened the folder and turned it to face me. What I saw made absolutely no sense. Documents, financial statements, property deeds, all bearing the name Helen Morrison, but with numbers that couldn't possibly be right. Thomas explained patiently, like he understood my brain was refusing to process what I was seeing. My grandmother Helen hadn't just been a seamstress. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. She'd been born Helen Morrison, sister to William Morrison, who'd built Morrison Pharmaceuticals from the ground up in the 1950s. William had been a genius chemist who'd developed 3 revolutionary medications that changed treatment protocols for heart disease. He'd become extraordinarily wealthy, but he'd never married, never had children. When he died 6 years ago, his will had been very specific. Everything went to his sister Helen, to be held in trust until her death, at which point it would pass to her sole heir, me. It would pass to me. I stared at the numbers on the financial statements, my vision blurring slightly. $72 million. 72 million. The number was so large it didn't feel real, like monopoly money or a typo that would be corrected any moment. Thomas continued talking, explaining that Helen had never touched the money. She'd lived on her seamstress income by choice, wanting to raise me with the same values she'd been raised with, the same understanding of hard work and self-sufficiency that had shaped her own character. She'd left instructions with Thomas that I wasn't to be told until after her death, and even then, only when I was established in my career and mature enough to handle it responsibly. The trust had been accumulating value for 2 years since Grandma Helen died, Thomas explained. He'd been waiting for what he felt was the right moment to contact me, watching from a distance to ensure I was stable and successful, before upending my understanding of everything. He'd seen I'd built a thriving practice, that I was engaged to be married, that my life seemed settled. He'd decided it was time. I asked him why Grandma Helen had lived the way she did if she'd had access to millions. Thomas smiled sadly and told me Helen had her reasons. She'd seen what wealth did to her brother William, how it isolated him, how people treated him differently, how he could never be sure if relationships were genuine or transactional. She'd chosen a different path, but she'd wanted me to have choices she'd never had. She'd wanted me to build my own life first, to know my own strength, and then to have resources to do whatever I wanted with that strength. I sat in that leather chair in Thomas Hendrick's office, surrounded by legal documents that proved I was worth more than the entire Whitfield family fortune combined, and I started laughing. Not happy laughter. The slightly unhinged laughter of someone whose life has turned inside out twice in 24 hours. Thomas looked concerned and offered me water again. I accepted it this time, drinking the entire glass while my brain tried to catch up with this new reality. The irony was so perfect, it felt like the universe had a twisted sense of humor. Brandon Whitfield, who saw me as a poor dentist desperate to climb the social ladder through marriage, who planned to control me through my supposed gratitude and financial dependence, who was cheating on me with complete confidence I'd never find out or do anything about it, that Brandon was unknowingly engaged to a woman worth $72 million. I asked Thomas what I needed to do to access the money. He explained there would be paperwork, meetings with financial advisors, decisions about investment strategies and tax implications, but the short answer was that it was mine, free and clear, as of right now. I could access it whenever I wanted. I could do whatever I wanted with it. There were no strings, no conditions beyond being Helen Morrison's granddaughter. Walking out of Thomas's office an hour later, I felt like I was floating. Everything looked different. The streets of Charleston, the people walking past me, the expensive cars parked along the curb. I'd been one person when I walked in and was someone completely different walking out. Not because the money changed who I was fundamentally, but because it changed what Brandon could do to me. It changed everything about the power dynamic I'd thought existed in our relationship. I drove to the practice for my afternoon patients, going through the motions of examinations and cleanings while my mind spun in circles. Mrs. Chen came, in for her 6-month checkup, a 73-year-old woman who still worked full-time at her family's restaurant because she loved it. She asked me about the wedding, excited about the upcoming ceremony. I heard myself tell her everything was wonderful, that I couldn't wait, and the lies felt surreal coming out of my mouth. Between patients, I sat in my small office and stared at my walls. I'd hung my diplomas there, my licenses, certificates from continuing education courses, physical proof of everything I'd accomplished through my own effort. My phone buzzed again. Brandon texting that we needed to finalize the rehearsal dinner plans, asking why I'd missed the meeting with his mother yesterday, wondering if I was okay. I typed and deleted 5 different responses before settling on something bland about not feeling well, apologizing for missing the meeting, promising to call him later. I wasn't ready to talk to him yet. I needed time to think, to process, to plan, because now I had options I hadn't had 24 hours ago. I could call off the wedding and walk away with my dignity and $72 million. I could confront him about Natalie and watch him scramble to explain. I could expose him to his family and friends, ruin his reputation the way he'd planned to manipulate mine. But something else was forming in my mind, something more satisfying than any of those options. Brandon thought I was malleable, grateful, naive. He thought he knew exactly who I was and how I'd behave. What if I let him keep thinking that? What if I played the role he'd assigned me, right up until the moment it would cause him maximum damage? The wedding was in 9 days. 9 days of continuing to be the eager, grateful fiancé while I planned something he'd never see coming. The thought made me smile for the first time since standing in that hallway at his mother's house. That evening, I drove to the jewelry store where we'd ordered our wedding rings. Brandon had insisted on Montgomery & Sons, the oldest, most prestigious jeweler in Charleston, where his family had bought jewelry for generations. The owner, Arthur Montgomery, greeted me warmly, asking if there was a problem with the rings. I told him no. I just wanted to see them one more time before the big day. He brought out the velvet box containing our matching platinum bands. Simple, elegant, expensive. Brandon had chosen them, of course, barely asking my opinion. While Arthur was showing me the rings, his assistant Martha came over, a woman in her 50s who'd been working there for decades. She smiled at me and made a casual comment about how generous Mr. Whitfield was, having been in just last week to purchase such a magnificent piece. My hands went still on the velvet ring box. I kept my voice carefully neutral, curious but not suspicious, and asked Martha what she meant. She looked delighted to share, the way people do when they think they're telling you good news. She described this stunning emerald necklace Brandon had commissioned, custom designed, absolutely exquisite. $47,000, she said, lowering her voice respectfully at the amount. She'd handled the engraving personally, wanting to make sure it was perfect. The inscription read, "For N, my true love." I felt the world tilt slightly, but kept my expression pleasant, interested. I said something about how Brandon was always so thoughtful with gifts, asked when he'd picked it up. Martha checked her records and told me it had been last Tuesday, 6 days ago, 8 days before our wedding. He'd spent $47,000 on an emerald necklace for his mistress, 8 days before marrying me. Arthur Montgomery, sensing something in my tone maybe, or just being a good businessman, gently suggested that perhaps it was meant as a wedding gift surprise for me. Martha looked confused, started to say something about the inscription, but Arthur gave her a sharp look, and she went quiet. I thanked them both, said the rings were perfect, and left before my composure could crack. Sitting in my car in the parking lot behind Montgomery & Sons, I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. $47,000 for N, my true love, not even trying to hide it, so confident I'd never find out, so absolutely certain of my ignorance and compliance. The rage that had been building since yesterday crystallized into something diamond-hard and unbreakable. I drove home and spent the evening doing something I'd never done before in our 3-year relationship. I went through every detail of Brandon's life that I had access to, looking for patterns I'd been too trusting to notice before. His credit card statements that he'd left on my kitchen counter once when working from my house. I'd photographed them with my phone without really thinking about why at the time, just some instinct to document. Now I looked at them with new eyes. Charges at expensive restaurants on nights he'd told me he was working late, hotel rooms in Charleston when he lived 20 minutes away, florist deliveries to addresses I didn't recognize. It was all there, a clear pattern of deception, and I'd been so eager to believe his explanations that I'd never questioned any of it. He'd told me those work dinners were with clients, that the hotel rooms were for out-of-town colleagues he was hosting, that the flowers were for his mother or sister. I'd believed every lie, because I'd wanted so desperately to belong in his world. I pulled up his social media, something I rarely looked at because he kept his accounts fairly private. But I was tagged in enough photos that I could piece together timelines. There, at a charity gala I hadn't attended because I'd had emergency patients that evening, Brandon with his arm around an elegant blonde woman in a red dress. The caption identified her as Natalie Ashford, attorney at Spencer & Klein. I clicked through to her. Profile: Harvard Law School, corporate litigation specialist. Family photos showing her at the Whitfield estate, at the country club, at exclusive events. She wasn't just his mistress. She was part of his world in ways I'd never been. She fit. I spent hours that night cross-referencing everything I could find. Natalie had been Brandon's girlfriend in college, according to some old photos I found. They'd dated for 2 years before apparently breaking up when he left for graduate school. But the photos together resumed about 18 months ago, exactly the timeline he'd mentioned to his mother. They'd reconnected, probably at some alumni event or through mutual friends, and just picked up where they'd left off. Except this time he was engaged to someone else, engaged to naive, grateful Rachel, who would never question him. The next day, Thursday, I had lunch with my best friend Simone. We'd met in college, roommates freshman year who'd stayed close even though our lives had gone in different directions. Simone was an ER nurse at MUSC, whip-smart and taking exactly zero bullshit from anyone. She was also supposed to be my maid of honor in 8 days. We met at our usual spot, a sandwich place near the hospital where Simone could grab a quick meal between shifts. She took one look at my face and knew something was catastrophically wrong. She asked if I was okay, and I realized I couldn't keep pretending anymore, at least not with her. I told her everything. The conversation I'd overheard, Brandon's affair with Natalie, the emerald necklace, the manipulation he'd planned. Simone's expression went from concerned to furious in about 30 seconds. She started to say I needed to call off the wedding immediately, that I needed to expose Brandon for the cheating scumbag he was, that I deserved so much better. I agreed with all of that, but then I told her about the inheritance. I watched her process the information, her eyes going wide, her mouth literally falling open. $72 million, I repeated. Brandon has no idea. Nobody knows except me, Thomas Hendricks, and now you. Simone leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. She asked what I was planning to do. I told her I wasn't completely sure yet, but I knew I wasn't going to just walk away quietly. Brandon thought he knew exactly who I was and how I'd behave. I was going to let him keep thinking that right up until the moment I proved him spectacularly wrong. We spent the rest of her lunch break gaming out possibilities. Simone's mind worked like mine did in a crisis, analytical and strategic. She pointed out that I had 8 days until the wedding. 8 days where Brandon would be completely off guard, thinking everything was going according to his plan. 8 days to gather more evidence, to position myself perfectly, to ensure maximum impact when I made my move. She asked if I was absolutely sure I wanted to go through with some kind of public confrontation. I could just call it off privately, she pointed out, and move on with my life and my unexpected fortune. Nobody would blame me. But I knew in my gut that wasn't enough. Brandon had counted on my silence, my compliance, my supposed gratitude keeping me controllable. He'd built his entire strategy around the assumption that I was too weak or too desperate to fight back. I needed him to understand how completely he'd misjudged me. That afternoon, I did something that felt simultaneously terrifying and empowering. I called Natalie Ashford's office. When her assistant answered, I identified myself as Rachel Morrison and said I needed to speak with Ms. Ashford about a personal matter concerning Brandon Whitfield. There was a long pause, then I was put on hold. Classical music played for 2 minutes before Natalie picked up, her voice cool and professional. She asked what she could do for me, and I could hear the wariness underneath her polished tone. I told her I knew about their relationship, that I'd found out quite by accident, and that I thought we should talk before the wedding. Woman to woman. There was silence on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear her calculating responses. Finally, she agreed to meet me for coffee the next morning, Friday, at a place far enough from downtown Charleston that we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. Friday morning, I woke up at 5:30, too anxious to sleep. I met Natalie Ashford at a coffee shop in Mount Pleasant at 7, a generic chain location where neither of us would see anyone from our social circles. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth wearing dark sunglasses even though we were indoors. When she took them off, I could see she was beautiful in that effortless way some women are, the kind of polished elegance that comes from good genes and better resources. Everything about her screamed old money and private schools, everything I wasn't. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She asked how I'd found out, and I told her I'd overheard Brandon talking to his mother. I watched her face carefully, looking for guilt or shame or anything human, but what I saw instead was calculation. She was weighing options, deciding what strategy to take with me. Finally, she leaned forward and asked what I wanted. Money to keep quiet, she assumed. A payoff to walk away gracefully. The assumption that I could be bought off with money almost made me laugh, given what I now knew about my own net worth. But I kept my expression neutral, hurt but not angry, exactly the kind of weak response she and Brandon would expect. I told her I didn't want money. I wanted to understand why. Why pursue a man who was engaged to someone else? Why help him deceive me? Natalie studied me for a long moment, then apparently decided honesty was the best approach. She told me that she and Brandon had been together in college, that they'd always planned to end up married, but that his family had pressured him to wait, to establish his career first, to not rush into anything. When they reconnected 18 months ago, they'd simply picked up where they left off. She said it with such casual confidence, as if their history gave them some kind of moral superiority over my relationship with him. I asked her if she knew Brandon was planning to marry me in 7 days. She said, of course she knew. She said it like I was stupid for asking. I asked if she thought that was wrong, if she felt any guilt about it at all. Natalie shrugged and told me that Brandon and I weren't compatible, that I didn't fit into his world, that this marriage would have ended in divorce within a few years anyway. She was doing me a favor, really, by giving Brandon what he actually needed so I wouldn't be stuck in a loveless marriage. The sheer audacity of her reasoning took my breath away. She'd reframed her affair as altruism, as if sleeping with my fiancé was some kind of charitable act on my behalf. I asked her what Brandon had told her about me, about our relationship. She hesitated, then said he'd explained that the engagement was complicated, that he cared about me, but that we wanted different things, that he was planning to end it after establishing his career further, but that the timing was difficult with family expectations and business connections. Every word out of her mouth was a lie Brandon had fed her, and I could see she believed all of it. He'd positioned himself as trapped, as doing his duty by marrying appropriate but boring Rachel, while his heart belonged to Natalie. He'd made himself the sympathetic figure in a story where I was just an obstacle to be managed. I wondered if Natalie knew about the emerald necklace, if she was wearing it under her expensive silk blouse right now. I thanked her for her honesty, told her I needed time to think about everything, and left. Walking back to my car, I felt this cold clarity settling over me like frost. Brandon hadn't just deceived me. He'd constructed an entire alternate reality where his cruelty was justified, where using me was reasonable, where I was so negligible as a person that my feelings didn't even merit consideration. And Natalie had bought into it completely, made herself comfortable in the role of patient other woman waiting for Brandon to extricate himself from his unfortunate engagement. That afternoon, I did something I'd been avoiding. I called Brandon and asked if we could have dinner, just the two of us, something quiet before the chaos of wedding week. He sounded surprised but pleased, probably thinking I was finally falling into line after being distant the past few days. We agreed to meet at 7 at a small Italian restaurant we both liked, casual and intimate. I spent an hour getting ready, choosing my outfit carefully, not too dressed up, not too casual. The version of Rachel that Brandon expected, the one who tried just hard enough but never quite succeeded in looking like she belonged in his world. I practiced my expressions in the mirror, making sure I could maintain the mask of loving, grateful fiancé, while my actual thoughts stayed locked safely behind my eyes. Brandon was already at the restaurant when I arrived, sitting at our usual table in the corner. He stood and kissed me, and I made myself return it normally, not flinching away even though my skin crawled at his touch. We ordered wine, made small talk about the wedding preparations, discussed the weather forecast for Sunday. He asked if I was feeling better, referencing my excuse for missing the meeting with his mother. I told him I'd had a migraine but was fine now. Throughout dinner, I watched him lie to my face with such practiced ease it was almost admirable. He talked about how excited he was for our future together, about the honeymoon in Tuscany he'd planned, about the house in the historic district we'd been considering. Every word was calculated to paint a picture of devoted husband-to-be, and if I hadn't known better, I would have believed every syllable. I asked him about work, and he launched into a story about a difficult client, about project delays and budget concerns. I asked if that lawyer, Natalie something, had been helpful with the contract negotiations he'd mentioned months ago. I watched his face carefully as I said her name. There was the smallest flicker, a momentary tension around his eyes, but he recovered smoothly. He said Natalie had been very professional, that the contracts were all finalized, that he probably wouldn't need to work with her firm again. The lies rolled off his tongue like water, effortless and natural. I wondered how many other lies I'd believed over 3 years, how many times he'd sat across from me like this and constructed elaborate fictions, while I'd smiled and nodded and trusted every word. The anger burning in my chest felt like it might consume me from the inside, but I kept my expression soft and adoring, kept playing my role. Brandon reached across the table and took my hand, told me how lucky he was to have found me, how much he loved me. I felt my throat tighten, not with emotion, but with the effort of not screaming at him. I squeezed his hand back and told him I loved him too, and the words tasted like ash in my mouth. Walking to my car after dinner, I realized I was shaking, not from fear or sadness, but from rage held so tightly under control that it had to express itself, physically, somehow. 6 more days. 6 more days of this performance, of pretending to be the naive, grateful woman he thought he'd trapped. 6 more days of letting him think he'd won, that his plan was working perfectly. Saturday morning, 5 days before the wedding, I woke up to 17 text messages in the family group chat Patricia had created for wedding coordination. Most were from Vivian, detailing last-minute changes to the flower arrangements and criticizing choices I'd made months ago. Patricia had added several messages about the rehearsal dinner on Friday night, reminding everyone that proper attire was required, that this was a Whitfield family tradition going back 4 generations, that standards needed to be maintained. The subtext was clear even through text messages. "Don't embarrass us, Rachel." I responded with enthusiastic agreement to everything, thanking them for their guidance, apologizing for any oversights, playing my part. Each message I sent felt like laying another brick in the foundation of what was coming. Let them think I was compliant. Let them think I was grateful for their condescension. Sunday was the final dress fitting. My wedding gown hung in the bridal boutique's private fitting room, ivory silk and French lace that had cost $18,000. Brandon's mother had insisted on this particular designer, had actually gasped when I'd initially suggested looking at more affordable options. The dress was beautiful, objectively stunning, but it had never felt like mine. It felt like a costume for the role I was supposed to play in the Whitfield family production. The seamstress, an older woman named Rosa, who'd been doing alterations for 40 years, pinned the final adjustments while I stood on the platform surrounded by mirrors. She told me I looked like a princess, that Brandon was a lucky man. I smiled and thanked her, catching my own reflection from multiple angles. The woman in the mirrors looked like a bride, excited, nervous, happy. I'd gotten very good at performing those emotions. Simone arrived near the end of the fitting, ostensibly to see the final result, but really to check on me. After Rosa finished and left us alone, Simone asked quietly if I was sure about going through with this plan. There was still time to just cancel everything, she reminded me. Call it off, keep my dignity, walk away with my head high and my bank account full. No one would blame me for ending an engagement after discovering infidelity, but that wasn't enough anymore. It had stopped being enough the moment I'd heard Brandon describe me as malleable to his mother, the moment Natalie had told me she was doing me a favor by sleeping with my fiancé, the moment I'd sat across from Brandon at dinner and watched him lie so smoothly while holding my hand. They all thought I was weak, that I could be managed, that my feelings and my dignity were negligible concerns in their larger plans. I told Simone I was certain, more certain than I'd been about anything in years. She studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. She asked what I needed from her. I told her just to be there, to be ready, to watch everything unfold, and to maybe have a glass of champagne ready for afterward, because I was definitely going to need it. Monday through Wednesday blurred together in a haze of final preparations. The rehearsal dinner was Friday evening, the wedding Sunday afternoon. I went through all the motions, attended all the meetings, smiled at all the right moments. Brandon's family treated me with their usual mixture of tolerance and condescension. Patricia made several comments about hoping I'd be less clumsy during the actual ceremony than I was during rehearsal. Vivian openly discussed how she'd redecorate after Brandon and I moved into the house his parents were giving us as a wedding gift, as if my input wasn't even worth considering. Brandon himself was attentive and affectionate, the perfect devoted fiancé. He brought me flowers on Tuesday, took me to lunch on Wednesday, called me every evening to say goodnight. The performance was flawless on both sides. He thought he was managing naive Rachel. I was documenting every lie, cataloging every manipulation, preparing for the moment when the mask would come off. Thursday evening, I met with Thomas Hendricks one final time before the wedding. I'd asked him to prepare something specific, documentation that would be irrefutable and devastating. He'd questioned whether I was certain, whether I'd thought through all the implications. I told him I'd never been more certain of anything. He'd nodded slowly and prepared exactly what I'd requested, sealed in an envelope I'd opened Sunday afternoon. Friday morning, the day of the rehearsal dinner, I woke up with my heart pounding. 24 hours. In 24 hours, this would all be over, one way or another. I went to the clinic for a half day, seeing my regular patients, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. Little Marcus came in for a follow-up, and his mother thanked me again for being so patient with him, for making him actually look forward to dentist appointments. She asked if I was excited about the wedding, about starting my new life. I told her I was ready for a new chapter, which was true in ways she couldn't imagine. The rehearsal dinner was at the Whitfield estate, naturally. Patricia had hired caterers from the most expensive restaurant in Charleston, had the gardens lit with thousands of fairy lights, had a string quartet playing classical music on the terrace. 75 guests, all from Brandon's side except for Simone and a handful of my colleagues from the clinic. The imbalance was stark and intentional. This wasn't a celebration of our union. It was a Whitfield family event, where I happened to be the nominal guest of honor. I wore a pale blue dress that Vivian had approved, simple and understated, nothing that would draw too much attention. My hair was pulled back in a neat bun, my makeup subtle, my jewelry minimal, the perfect supporting player in someone else's production. Brandon kept his arm around my waist as we circulated through the crowd, introducing me to distant relatives and family friends, telling them all how grateful he was that I'd agreed to marry him, how lucky he was. The irony of those words, knowing what I knew, nearly made me laugh out loud several times. I maintained my composure, played my part, smiled until my face hurt. Patricia made a toast about welcoming me into the family, her tone making it clear this was more obligation than desire. Charles Whitfield, Brandon's father, gave a rambling speech about family legacy and maintaining standards that was clearly directed more at his son than at me. Then Brandon stood up to give his own toast. He took my hand, pulled me up beside him, and told the assembled guests how much he loved me. He talked about the moment we met, about knowing immediately that I was special, about how my kindness and authenticity had captured his heart. Every word was a carefully constructed lie, and 75 people believed every syllable. I looked out at the faces watching us, all these people from Brandon's world, who'd never fully accepted me, who'd treated me with barely concealed condescension for 3 years. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow everything changes. Sunday afternoon arrived with perfect Charleston weather, 72 degrees and sunny, the kind of day that wedding planners dream about. St. Philip's Church stood magnificent in the historic district, its white steeple rising against the blue sky, its bells ringing to announce the ceremony. 300 guests filled the pews, Charleston's elite dressed in their finest, here to witness Brandon Whitfield marry the little dentist from the wrong side of the tracks, who'd somehow managed to snag him. I stood in the bride's room adjacent to the church sanctuary, looking at myself in the full-length mirror. The $18,000 dress fit perfectly after Rosa's alterations. My hair was arranged in an elaborate updo that had taken 2 hours to create. My makeup was flawless, applied by a professional who'd charged $800 for the service. I looked exactly like the bride Brandon Whitfield expected to walk down that aisle, grateful and compliant and ready to play her assigned role. Simone stood beside me, officially there as my maid-of-honor, but really there as my anchor, my witness, my friend, who knew what was about to happen. She asked me one last time if I was ready, if I was absolutely certain. I turned away from the mirror and looked at her directly, and whatever she saw in my face made her nod slowly. She handed me my bouquet, white roses and peonies that matched the arrangements throughout the church, and told me she was proud of me. The wedding coordinator knocked on the door, a harried woman named Michelle, who'd been organizing Whitfield family events for 20 years. She announced it was time, that the processional music was about to start, that everyone was waiting. I took a deep breath, feeling my heart rate slow rather than speed up. This was it, the moment I'd been planning for, preparing for, dreaming about since hearing Brandon's words through that library door 12 days ago. I walked through the church hallways to the sanctuary doors, my heels clicking on the marble floor. Through the closed doors, I could hear the string quartet playing, could sense the anticipation of 300 guests waiting to see the bride. The doors opened, and the music swelled into the wedding march. Every face turned toward me, every eye watching as I began my walk down that long, white-carpeted aisle. I saw Patricia in the front row, her expression satisfied and superior, secure in the knowledge that her son was managing this situation perfectly. I saw Vivian beside her, wearing a dress that was clearly more expensive than mine, probably her own little power play. I saw Charles, barely paying attention, checking his phone even during his son's wedding ceremony. I saw colleagues from Brandon's firm, friends from his country club, family members I'd met at various functions over the past 3 years. All these people who'd looked at me like I was lucky to be here. And I saw Brandon standing at the altar, looking confident and handsome in his custom tuxedo, his expression one of controlled satisfaction. He thought this was his victory moment, the culmination of his perfect plan. Marry the grateful dentist, keep the sophisticated mistress, have everything arranged exactly as he wanted it. I could see it in his eyes, that absolute certainty that he'd won, that he'd successfully manipulated everything to his advantage. I reached the altar and stood facing him. Pastor Williams, who'd known the Whitfield family for 30 years, smiled benevolently at both of us and began the traditional ceremony. We'd gone through this at rehearsal, knew exactly what came when. The opening blessing, the reading from Corinthians, the homily about love and commitment. I barely heard any of it. My mind focused on what was coming, on the moment that was approaching, with the inevitability of a train barreling down tracks. Pastor Williams reached the vows, that sacred moment when bride and groom promised themselves to each other. He turned to Brandon first, asked him if he took me to be his lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do them part. Brandon said, "I do," clearly and confidently, his voice carrying through the church. Several people in the audience sighed happily. Patricia dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, performing maternal emotion. Brandon reached for my hands, squeezing them gently, playing his role perfectly. Then Pastor Williams turned to me. The church went completely silent, that breathless anticipation of the bride's response. He asked if I, Rachel Morrison, took Brandon Whitfield to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do us part. I looked at Brandon, at his confident face, at his satisfied smile. I looked past him at his family, at the 300 guests, at this entire production that had been designed to trap me in a life of manipulation and disrespect. And I said, clearly and firmly, no. The single syllable echoed through the church like a gunshot. The silence that followed was absolute, so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Brandon's expression went from confident to confused to panicked in the span of 3 seconds. Pastor Williams actually took a step back, his mouth open. I heard gasps from the audience, someone's phone hitting the floor, the rustle of 300 people simultaneously shifting in their seats. I turned away from Brandon to face the congregation directly, still holding my bouquet, my voice steady and clear. I told them I couldn't marry a man who saw me as nothing more than a controllable piece in his game. I couldn't promise my life to someone who described me as malleable and submissive to his mother. I couldn't stand at this altar and pretend I didn't know the truth about who Brandon Whitfield really was. Brandon tried to interrupt, tried to take my arm, but I stepped away from him smoothly. I told the shocked audience that I had recordings, that 12 days ago I'd stood outside the Whitfield family library and heard Brandon explain to his mother and sister exactly why he was marrying me, how I was too grateful to question him, how I was too naive to discover his affair, how I would be the perfect wife because I could be controlled. Patricia half stood from her seat, her face white with rage or shock or both. I kept going, my voice never wavering. I told them about Natalie Ashford, about the 18-month affair Brandon had been conducting throughout our engagement. I told them about the emerald necklace, $47,000, engraved, "For N, my true love," purchased 8 days before our wedding. I reached into my bouquet, where I'd hidden a small envelope between the roses and peonies. I pulled out the receipt from Montgomery & Sons jewelry store, holding it up so the front rows could see. Martha, the sales assistant, had been kind enough to provide me with a copy after I'd explained the situation, her face horrified when she realized what Brandon had done. The receipt clearly showed the date, the amount, and a description of the custom engraving. I read it aloud for those in the back who couldn't see. "For N, my true love, purchased September 21st, 8 days before he planned to marry me." Brandon's face had gone from panicked to furious. He stepped toward me, his voice low and threatening, telling me I was making a scene, that I was embarrassing myself, that we could discuss this privately. The controlling tone was automatic, instinctive, exactly what he'd always used when he wanted to manage me, but there was desperation underneath it now. He could feel everything slipping away from him, his carefully constructed image crumbling in front of everyone who mattered to him. I told him I was done with private discussions, done with letting him control the narrative, done with protecting his reputation at the expense of my own dignity. Then I turned back to the congregation and dropped my second bomb. I told them about my inheritance, about being the sole heir to William Morrison's pharmaceutical fortune. I watched understanding dawn on faces throughout the church, watched people doing the mental math. Morrison Pharmaceuticals, $72 million. The poor little dentist Brandon had condescended to marry was worth more than his entire family combined. The irony was so perfect, so absolutely poetic, that I saw several people's expressions shift from shock to something almost like amusement. All this time, Brandon had thought he was marrying down, doing me a favor, acquiring a grateful wife who would never question him because she was so lucky to have him. And all this time, unknown to him, I'd had the resources to walk away from him without a backward glance. The power dynamic he'd built his entire strategy around had been completely inverted, and he'd never known. Patricia found her voice then, standing fully and demanding to know what kind of game I was playing. How dare I humiliate her family like this? Who did I think I was? Her voice had that aristocratic outrage of someone who'd never been publicly challenged before. I turned to face her directly and told her I was Rachel Morrison, granddaughter of Helen Morrison, who'd raised me to value dignity over status, who'd taught me that self-respect was worth more than any amount of social climbing. I was a dentist who'd built a successful practice serving working families, who'd earned every single thing I had through my own effort. And now, I told Patricia, I was also a woman wealthy enough to buy her precious estate 3 times over without making a dent in my inheritance. So her condescension about my profession, her comments about my background, her barely concealed contempt for everything I was, all of it meant exactly nothing. I didn't need the Whitfield name or the Whitfield money or the Whitfield social connections. I never had. Vivian stood up beside her mother, her face twisted with rage, and screamed that I was lying, that this was all some desperate ploy to save face after being left at the altar. Except Brandon hadn't left me. I'd left him. That distinction seemed to be slowly sinking in throughout the congregation. The whispers were starting now, hundreds of conversations happening simultaneously as people processed what they were witnessing. I pulled out the second envelope from my bouquet, this one thicker official documents from Thomas Hendrick's office. I'd had him prepare copies of the inheritance paperwork, the financial statements, the trust documents, everything verified, notarized, irrefutable. I walked down from the altar and handed the envelope to Patricia directly, told her she could verify every word with Thomas Hendricks at Hendricks & Associates. My grandmother's estate, William Morrison's will, all of it documented and legal and absolutely true. Brandon tried one more time, his voice taking on that persuasive tone he used when he wanted to manipulate a situation back under his control. He said I was upset, understandably so, but that we could work through this. He'd made mistakes, he admitted, but he loved me. We could go to counseling, could rebuild trust, could make this marriage work. The lies came so easily to him, so smoothly, even now with everything exposed and 300 witnesses watching. I turned back to face him one final time. I told him he didn't love me, that he'd never loved me, that I wasn't even sure he was capable of loving anyone beyond himself. What he loved was the idea of me, the compliant wife who would never question him, who would be so grateful for his attention that she'd tolerate anything. But that version of Rachel Morrison had never actually existed. She'd been a performance, and I was done performing. I told him about my coffee with Natalie, about how she'd described their relationship with such casual confidence, how she'd explained that she was doing me a favor by giving Brandon what he actually needed. I watched his face pale as he realized I'd spoken directly to his mistress, that I'd heard her version of their story. I told the congregation about Natalie's explanation that Brandon had portrayed our engagement as an obligation, something he was trapped in by family expectations and business connections, that he was planning to end it eventually, but the timing was complicated. Several people in the audience gasped. Others pulled out their phones, probably texting or looking up Natalie Ashford to confirm she existed. I saw one of Brandon's groomsmen, his best friend Marcus from college, staring at Brandon with this expression of disgust and betrayal. Even his own friends hadn't known the extent of his deception. I had one final revelation, the piece de resistance I'd been saving. I told them that starting Monday, I would be establishing the Helen Morrison Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to supporting women entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds. The foundation would provide grants, mentorship, and resources to help women build businesses and careers without having to depend on wealthy husbands or family connections for their success. It would be funded with $20 million from my inheritance, and I would serve as its director. The foundation would be everything the E. Whitfields weren't. Supportive instead of condescending, empowering instead of controlling, built on respect instead of manipulation, and it would carry my grandmother's name, honoring the woman who'd raised me to know my own worth, even when everyone around me was telling me I should be grateful for scraps. I looked at Brandon one last time, at this man I'd almost married, who'd almost trapped me in a lifetime of manipulation and disrespect. I told him he'd made one critical miscalculation. He'd thought my humble background made me weak, made me controllable, made me desperate enough to tolerate anything. But actually, it had made me strong. It had taught me the value of dignity, of self-respect, of knowing exactly what I was worth, regardless of what anyone else thought. Then I dropped my bouquet at his feet, turned, and walked back down that long aisle. 300 pairs of eyes watched me go. I heard the whispers crescendoing behind me, heard someone starting to clap slowly, heard the chaos beginning to erupt as people realized the show was completely over. Simone met me at the back doors, her face split in the biggest smile I'd ever seen, and we walked out of St. Philip's Church together into the Charleston sunshine. Behind me, I left Brandon standing at the altar surrounded by the wreckage of his reputation. I left his family dealing with the social catastrophe of a very public rejection. I left 300 guests with the story they'd be telling at dinner parties for years. And I walked toward my car, my future, my freedom, feeling lighter than I had in 3 years. 3 months later, I stood in the new office space for the Helen Morrison Foundation, watching contractors install the last of the equipment. We'd taken over a beautiful historic building on King Street, 3 floors of brick and tall windows that I'd purchased outright with foundation funds. The ground floor would house our main offices and a community meeting space. The second floor was dedicated to educational workshops and mentorship programs. The third floor held private offices where grant recipients could meet with business advisors, accountants, and lawyers we'd brought on staff. My own office overlooked King Street, and I decorated it simply with photos of Grandma Helen, my dental school diploma, and a framed copy of the Foundation's mission statement. Every morning when I arrived, I read those words and felt grateful all over again for the courage to walk away from Brandon Whitfield's trap. The Foundation had officially launched 6 weeks after the wedding that wasn't, and the response had been overwhelming. We'd received over 800 applications for our first round of grants in the first month alone. Women starting businesses, women going back to school, women escaping bad situations, and needing resources to rebuild their lives independently. Reading their stories reminded me over and over why I'd made the choices I'd made that Sunday afternoon in St. Philip's Church. We'd awarded our first 50 grants 2 weeks ago, amounts ranging from $5,000 to $50,000, depending on need and business plan viability. I'd personally met with each recipient, shaking their hands, looking them in the eyes, telling them I believed in them. Several had cried. One woman, a single mother of 3 starting a catering business, had hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe and whispered that I'd changed her life. Those moments made everything worth it. My dental practice had actually grown in the months since the wedding disaster. Apparently, publicly humiliating Charleston's elite at your own wedding ceremony was excellent marketing, at least among working-class families who'd felt looked down on by that same elite their entire lives. My patient base had increased by 40%, and I'd hired 2 additional dentists to help manage the load. We'd expanded into the space next door, doubled our capacity, and I'd implemented a program offering completely free care to families below a certain income threshold, funded by my inheritance. Little Marcus, my formerly terrified patient, had brought his baby sister in for her first appointment last week. He'd held her hand the entire time, telling her there was nothing to be scared of, that Dr. Morrison was the nicest dentist in the whole world. His mother had thanked me again, mentioning that she'd seen the news coverage of the Foundation and thought what I was doing was beautiful. Her words had meant more to me than any society page approval ever could have. Brandon's life had gone somewhat differently. The story of our failed wedding had spread through Charleston like wildfire, picked up by local news, then regional, then somehow going viral on social media. Charleston's runaway bride leaves groom at altar after exposing his affair and secret fortune, the headlines had read. The details had been too delicious for media to resist. Wealthy engineer, planning to control his poor dentist fiancé, discovers she's actually richer than his entire family. Mistress exposed. Family humiliated. Public rejection witnessed by 300 of Charleston's finest. His engineering firm had lost several major contracts within weeks, clients not wanting to be associated with the scandal. His reputation in Charleston's business community was essentially destroyed. Nobody wanted to work with the man who'd been so publicly exposed as a manipulative cheater, especially after several other women had come forward with their own stories about Brandon's behavior over the years. Apparently, I hadn't been his first target, just the one who'd fought back publicly. Natalie Ashford had also faced consequences. Spencer & Klein, her law firm, had quietly asked her to resign after the scandal broke. Corporate litigation required trust and discretion, and a lawyer who'd participated so openly in an affair with an engaged man didn't inspire confidence in either. Quality. Last I'd heard, she'd moved to Atlanta, starting over somewhere no one knew her story. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered her telling me she was doing me a favor by sleeping with my fiancé, and the sympathy evaporated. Patricia Whitfield had attempted damage control, trying to spread rumors that I'd made everything up, that the inheritance was fabricated, that I was a scorned woman seeking revenge. Those rumors had died quickly once Thomas Hendricks released a statement confirming every detail of my inheritance, complete with verified documentation. After that, Patricia had simply retreated from public life, canceling her memberships at several clubs, turning down invitations to events she'd previously dominated. The humiliation of having her son's manipulation exposed, of being proven so completely wrong about me, had broken something in her social confidence. Charles Whitfield had apparently told Patricia the whole situation was her fault for pushing Brandon toward an inappropriate match in the first place, which had caused its own marital crisis. Vivian had gotten engaged to some finance guy from Atlanta and was planning a wedding far away from Charleston, probably hoping distance would help people forget she'd been part of the family that had treated me so terribly. As for Brandon himself, he'd moved to Charlotte about a month after the wedding disaster. Starting over somewhere, his reputation wasn't completely destroyed. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he was working for a smaller firm, making considerably less money, keeping a much lower profile. He'd tried to call me twice in the weeks after the wedding, leaving voicemails that ranged from angry to apologetic to attempting manipulation. One more time. I'd blocked his number after the second call. I had nothing more to say to him. Simone had become the foundation's volunteer coordinator, organizing the mentor network we'd built connecting successful businesswomen with grant recipients. She'd taken to the role immediately, using her natural leadership skills to create a community that felt supportive rather than hierarchical. She'd told me at least a dozen times that watching me walk down that aisle and say no had been the most badass thing she'd ever witnessed in person. I'd reconnected with several former patients and colleagues who'd reached out after the wedding story broke, wanting to offer support or share their own stories of standing up to people who'd underestimated them. Those conversations had reminded me that I wasn't alone, that what had happened to me was part of a larger pattern of people, especially women, being judged by their backgrounds rather than their character or accomplishments. My relationship status remained happily single. I'd had exactly zero interest in dating since the Brandon disaster, and I suspected that would continue for quite some time. I'd learned that being alone was infinitely better than being with someone who diminished me. Solitude I'd chosen was more peaceful than company that required constant performance, constant shrinking of myself to fit someone else's expectations. The foundation office was hosting an open house tomorrow, inviting community members to learn about our programs and meet our staff. I'd hired 15 people so far, prioritizing women with backgrounds similar to mine, women who'd worked their way up from nothing and understood what our grant recipients were facing. The team I'd built felt like family in a way the Whitfields never had, bound together by shared values rather than obligation or bloodline. I spent yesterday afternoon walking through my grandmother's bungalow, the house I'd almost sold to help fund Brandon's vision of our future. I'd had it renovated in the past month, updating the kitchen and bathrooms while carefully preserving everything that made it Helen's house. Her sewing machine still sat in the corner of the living room, now, spotlit and treated as the art installation it deserved to be. A plaque beside it read, Helen Morrison, 1945-2023, who taught her granddaughter that dignity cannot be purchased or taken away, only recognized or denied. I'd turned the second bedroom into a small library, filling it with books about entrepreneurship, women's history, financial literacy. Grant recipients could borrow anything they needed. The walls were lined with photos of Grandma Helen at different ages, working at her sewing machine, raising me, living her life with quiet dignity despite having millions she never touched. I understood her choices better now. She'd wanted me to know my own strength before I knew about the money, to build my identity around what I could accomplish rather than what I could buy. Standing in that house yesterday, I'd cried for the first time since the wedding. Not sad tears, but something else. Relief, maybe. Gratitude. The overwhelming sensation of having narrowly escaped something that would have slowly killed who I was. If I hadn't overheard that conversation in the Whitfield library, if I'd married Brandon in ignorance, how long would it have taken before I completely lost myself? How many years of subtle manipulation, of being made to feel grateful for disrespect, of shrinking myself smaller and smaller to fit his requirements? I thought about the alternate version of Rachel, who'd said yes at that altar, who'd married Brandon and discovered the truth later, trapped by legal and social obligations, that Rachel would have been miserable, probably divorced within 5 years, definitely scarred by the experience in ways that would have taken decades to heal. I'd been saved by pure chance, by happening to arrive early to a meeting, by a door being left slightly open, by being in the right place at the wrong time or the wrong place at the right time, depending on perspective. The press attention had mostly died down now, though I still got occasional requests for interviews. I'd done exactly one, with a journalist from a women's magazine who'd promised to focus on the foundation rather than the scandal. That interview had been republished and shared thousands of times, apparently resonating with women who'd felt underestimated or controlled in their own relationships. I'd received hundreds of emails from women sharing their stories, thanking me for showing that standing up for yourself was possible even at the moment when everyone expected you to comply. Some of those emails had broken my heart. Women who'd stayed in bad marriages for years, who'd believed they had no other options, who'd been told so many times that they should be grateful that they'd internalized it completely. Women who'd sacrificed their own dreams and identities to prop up men who never appreciated those sacrifices. Reading their stories had reinforced my commitment to the foundation, to creating tangible pathways for women to build independent lives. My parents would have been proud, I thought. I barely remembered them, killed in that car accident when I was 6, but Grandma Helen had always told me they'd valued authenticity above everything. My mother had been a teacher, my father a mechanic, both of them working-class people who'd loved each other genuinely and raised me for 6 years with kindness and respect. They'd taught me, in the brief time I had with them, that love meant support, not control. That lesson had been reinforced by Grandma Helen and had ultimately saved me from a marriage that would have been the opposite of everything they'd modeled. This morning, I'd met with a young woman named Keisha, who'd applied for a grant to start a hair salon in a predominantly black neighborhood that had been underserved for decades. She'd worked as a stylist for 15 years, saved every penny, dreamed of owning her own business, but never had access to startup capital. Banks had turned her down repeatedly, citing insufficient collateral, which really meant they were unwilling to invest in her neighborhood. Sitting across from Keisha in my office, listening to her describe her business plan with such passion and precision, I'd seen myself. Different industry, different specifics, but the same fundamental story. A woman with skill and determination and no connections, trying to build something meaningful, despite every structural barrier telling her she couldn't. I'd approved her grant application for $35,000 on the spot, enough to lease space, purchase equipment, and operate for 6 months while building clientele. Keisha had cried, thanking me over and over, and I told her the same thing I told every grant recipient. She didn't owe me gratitude. She owed me success. She owed herself the commitment to build the business she'd dreamed of, to serve her community well, and someday, when she was established, to help another woman the way I was helping her now. Pay it forward, not back. That was the Foundation's philosophy. Tonight, I was having dinner with Simone and Maya, my dental assistant who'd become a close friend through everything. Just the 3 of us at a casual restaurant, celebrating the Foundation's 3-month anniversary and my 3-month anniversary of freedom from Brandon Whitfield. We'd laugh, drink wine, probably tell the wedding story one more time because it never got old, and remind ourselves that we'd built something real and good from what could have been a devastating experience. I'd learned so much in these 3 months. I'd learned that anger, properly channeled, could be constructive rather than destructive, that standing up for yourself, even when it was terrifying, even when it meant public spectacle, was always worth it, that the opinions of people who'd never respected you didn't matter once you stopped seeking their approval, that wealth was a tool, not an identity, and how you used it defined who you were, far more than simply having it. I'd also learned that I was stronger than I'd ever known. Dental school had been hard, building my practice had been hard, but nothing had tested me like standing at that altar and saying no, like looking at 300 shocked faces and exposing every ugly truth without flinching, like walking away from the life I'd thought I wanted and toward the life I deserved. That strength had always been in me, built by Grandma Helen's example and my own experiences, but I'd never had to access it so completely before. The Helen Morrison Foundation would help 200 women in its first year, I projected. By year 5, hopefully 1,000. By year 10, maybe more. Each woman who received a grant, who built a business, who achieved independence, represented a small victory against the Brandon Whitfields of the world, against everyone who believed that gratitude could be weaponized, that desperation could be exploited, that certain people deserved to be controlled. Looking back at the woman I'd been 3 months ago, standing in the Whitfield hallway hearing my fiancé describe me as malleable, I barely recognized her. That Rachel had been so busy trying to be enough for people who would never value her that she'd nearly lost sight of her actual worth. She'd measured herself by their standards, sought their approval, believed their narrative about who she was and what she deserved. This Rachel, the one standing in the Foundation office watching sunlight stream through tall windows onto the Helen Morrison Memorial Library sign, knew exactly who she was: a dentist, an entrepreneur, a philanthropist, a granddaughter honoring her grandmother's legacy, a woman who'd chosen dignity over compliance, truth over comfort, freedom over belonging to people who never wanted her anyway. If you're reading this story, if you recognize something of yourself in my experience, I want you to know something. You are not obligated to be grateful for disrespect. You are not required to shrink yourself to fit someone else's expectations. You are not defined by what others think you deserve. Your worth is inherent, not conditional. And anyone who tells you otherwise is trying to control you. Walking away might be terrifying. Standing up for yourself might cause chaos. Choosing dignity might mean losing things you thought you wanted. But I promise you, from someone who's been there, who's done it, who's lived through the aftermath, it is always worth it. Always. Being feared and alone is infinitely better than being loved and invisible. Solitude you choose beats company that diminishes you every single time. The Foundation's open house tomorrow would showcase everything we'd built. Grant recipients would share their stories. Mentors would describe the program. Local press would cover it. And I would stand there, in the organization bearing my grandmother's name, and know that I'd transformed the worst moment of my life into something that mattered. Something that would outlast the scandal, outlast Brandon's manipulation, outlast every condescending comment Patricia Whitfield ever made about my profession or my background. I walked to the window and looked out at King Street, at Charleston moving through a Tuesday afternoon, all these people living their own complicated lives, with their own struggles and triumphs. Somewhere in this city, there was probably a woman right now in a situation like mine had been, undervalued and manipulated and believing she had no better options. Maybe she'd hear about the Foundation. Maybe she'd apply for a grant. Maybe my story would give her the courage to stand up for herself. That possibility, more than anything, made everything worthwhile, made the public humiliation worth enduring, made the loss of the life I'd thought I wanted feel like the gain it actually was, made standing at that altar and saying no the best decision I'd ever made. My phone buzzed with a text from Simone, asking if I was still at the office, and reminding me about dinner reservations in an hour. I grabbed my bag, took one last look around the Foundation space, and headed for the door. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and victories. Tonight was for celebrating how far I'd come, how much I'd survived, how completely I'd reclaimed my own story. I thought about Grandma Helen one more time, imagined what she'd say if she could see all this. Probably something simple and profound about dignity, about knowing your worth, about never letting anyone make you feel less than you are. And then she'd smile, the way she always did, and tell me she always knew I had it in me. She was right. I always did. I just had to discover it for myself, standing at an altar in an $18,000 dress, saying one word that changed everything. No. The most powerful word I'd ever spoken. The beginning of everything that mattered. If you've been inspired by this story, consider subscribing to hear more about the Foundation's work and the women we help. And if you're facing your own moment of decision, your own choice between compliance and dignity, remember this: you are worth fighting for. You always have been. Sometimes you just need to remind yourself, and everyone else, of that truth. Being underestimated was Brandon Whitfield's biggest mistake. Proving him wrong was my greatest triumph. And building something meaningful from the wreckage, that's the legacy Grandma Helen deserves. The life I was always meant to live. And the future that starts now, every single day, with choosing myself first.